I want to invite you, if you will, to open in your Old Testament to 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17. It's good to see everyone tonight. Glad you taken the time to come out and to worship the Lord and to study for a little bit with us, especially if you're visiting. We're thankful for that. We hope that you'll give us an opportunity to meet you if we haven't had that chance already. You know, one of the realities of really almost any profession is the necessity of what we typically refer to as continuing education. And it's not uncommon for people to participate in, workshops or seminars or conferences or other types of training, because there's an ongoing need to train people for the challenges that they face in the work that they do and to prepare them for the things that they're going to face in the future in their jobs. And what I want us to see this evening is that continuing education is also a reality among the servants of God. You see it really in one fashion or another all through the scriptures. In our study tonight, I want us to talk a little bit about the prophet Elijah. And just to kind of set the stage for what we're going to look at, by this point in time, by the time we get to this point in Elijah's story, he had already confronted King Ahab with news that the rain was going to stop, and he had gone into hiding, it says up in verse 3 of 1 Kings 17, by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. It's out in the wilderness. And so God sent Elijah there, and the reason he sent him there, I'm convinced, or at least one of the reasons, was to form his character. It was an educational experience, you might say. He needed some training in the wilderness. And the record goes on to say in verse 7 of chapter 17, that after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. I wouldn't be surprised if Elijah, kind of wondered what was going on here. I mean, he thought God had called him to deal with Baal worship in Israel, and here he was out in the wilderness. He doesn't have anything to drink. But regardless, Elijah stayed where God put him. He obeyed God, even though it put him in an uncomfortable situation. In our lesson tonight, we're gonna see that Elijah received some new instructions from God. It was time for him to leave the brook Kerith, but it wasn't time to go back and to confront Baal worship in Israel. Instead, Elijah was sent to the city of Zarephath for some continuing education, you might say. And this continuing education took the form of a number of different tests, a number of different trials that he experienced. You look at the word Zarephath. It means to melt down. The noun form of the word was what they would use to refer to a crucible, where you would take substances and that needed to be purified or something along those lines. They use high degree of heat in order to bring that about. And before God can use a person, he or she has to spend some time in the crucible, it seems to me. God still had some refining to do before Elijah was ready for his meeting with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. And so in our lesson tonight, I want us to first notice how it was that Elijah was tested in Zarephath. And there's a number of them, and we'll go through them rather quickly. And then I want us to notice several lessons that I think we can learn from Elijah's experience and things that we are meant to get from that. And so we're going to spend most of our time just here in 1 Kings chapter 17. So just get in that chapter and get comfortable there, because that's what we're going to look at. We're not going to read all of it to begin with, but we'll kind of look at little snippets as we go along. And so in our passage, what we're going to find is that Elijah goes through 5 tests. And again, we're going to cover these just kind of briefly, each one of them. The first test that I want us to see is that Elijah was confronted with what I'm going to call the surprising directions test. In verse 8, it says that the word of the Lord came to him and said, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there." And when we first read these words, they may not seem terribly surprising to us. I mean, we can kind of go through, and whatever we read, we just kind of take it and go with that. But I wonder what he thought about this. Zarephath? Zarephath that belongs to Sidon? You can understand why he might have been a little shocked by that command when you consider that Zarephath was right in the middle of what you might refer to as enemy territory. If you recall, he is dealing with King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And Jezebel, we were told back in chapter 16 and verse 31, is the daughter of Ethbaal, king of what? of the Sidonians. And I don't know about you, but I can't imagine her father being a much better person than she was, and she wasn't much. And so instead of destroying Baal worship in Israel at this point, God is sending Elijah to go and stay in the very heart of Baal country, and I'm sure that came as somewhat of a surprise to him. Now, let me ask you a question this evening. Have you ever had to take the surprising directions test in your life? Have you ever prayed to God, for example, for guidance, and then found the direction that went surprising to you? Things like that test our willingness to follow the Lord, don't they? And we sometimes sing the words in our worship services, where he leads, I'll follow. And we do that without giving much thought to that, don't we? But at those times that we come face to face with the reality that it doesn't always go the direction we think it will, we have to ask the question, will I really follow wherever he leads? That's a difficult test, isn't it? But there's a second test I want you to see. Elijah was confronted with the humbling assignment test. Look at verse 9 again. I didn't read all the way through it this past time. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. And so I want you to get a picture of what's going on here. Just a few months before this, Elijah stood before King Ahab, and he declared that there would be a drought in Israel. And after that, he went out into the wilderness, and we're told that he was fed by birds. And then God commanded him to go to Zarephath, where he would be taken care of by a widow. And do you think he ever thought to himself in all of that, am I not capable of taking care of myself? I could understand it if you wanted to send me somewhere and I was supposed to take care of a widow. I might understand that. But do I need a widow to take care of me? You think that was a little bit humbling for him? I don't know if Elijah was ever tempted to think too highly of himself, but I do know that's not an uncommon problem, and that's even among the people of God, isn't it? And there are all kinds of situations that might serve to humble us. You know, sometimes we're humbled by the person that we're called upon to serve. Or maybe we're humbled by the circumstances under which we are called upon to serve. At other times, we're humbled by the person who is called upon to serve us, or the circumstances under which others serve us. And I'm convinced that it takes just as much humility to handle one situation and to do it well as it does the other. And we know that it takes humility to serve other people. Jesus talked about that. But it also takes humility to allow others to serve us as well. That's not always easy, is it? We want to be in the position of power, so to speak. But there's a third test we see in this. Elijah was confronted with what I would call the rough beginning test. You know, kind of like the PowerPoint. We're having a little rough beginning with that. Look at verse 10. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Because God had commanded him to do this, Elijah traveled somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 miles or so to the northwest. And after passing the welcome to Zarephath sign, he encounters this widow who's supposed to take care of him. And if you remember, the Lord had said back in verse 9, I have commanded a widow there to feed you, or to provide for you, some translations say. But you can read all up and down chapter 17, and what you will not find is that the Lord never said, and she is super excited about your arrival. It's not there. There are times when we may think everything has been worked out, at least in principle, only to have those expectations shattered. And it's hard to recover after a rough beginning, isn't it? Preachers have found that working with churches. Churches have found that working with preachers. Christians in general have found that to be true in dealing with one another. Husbands and wives sometimes have rough beginnings. And we could just go on and on and on with different examples. But what we have to guard against is the mindset that says, this isn't working, this was a big mistake, I'm out of here. I don't know how Elijah felt initially. But the point is, he stayed. He went where God told him, and he stayed. The fourth test Elijah is confronted with is the physical impossibilities test. Look at verse 13. Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. And the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. You look at this situation. How in the world is a starving widow going to take care of a hungry prophet? It looks to me like Elijah had to draw upon some lessons that he had just learned by the brook Kerith when he faced this particular test. And here is the lesson that Elijah was taught. It doesn't matter how bad the situation looks. It doesn't matter how bad it seems. God can take care of things. He can supply every need. And Elijah passed the test. He trusted God. He trusted the provider. He didn't look at the provisions. You ever looked at a situation and thought to yourself, I don't know how this is going to work out? I suspect we all have. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that thought going through our minds. All depends on how we respond to it. Some people have thoughts like that and they conclude, this is not going to work out. They like to think of themselves as realists, but sometimes they're just pessimists. Other people have thoughts like that, and really the only question for them is, I don't know how God's going to see me through this, but I know that he is. I know that for a fact. And so the question we need to ask is, are we going to focus on the provisions? That's what we tend to do. Or are we going to focus on the provider? That's what Elijah did. And then finally, before we move on, Elijah's confronted with the how long test. We don't have any record of God calling Elijah as a prophet, but there's no doubt in my mind that he did. And it appears that God raised him up for the very purpose of dealing with Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets of Baal, all of that going on in Israel at this point in time. And so Elijah delivered one message to King Ahab, and then he takes this long leave of absence. And during this period of time, Israel is continuing to be destroyed by Baal worship. And Elijah proved that he was willing to be the spokesman for God, for the one true God. So what is the holdup? The holdup is this: God does everything in his time, not ours. And I think that's one of the hardest lessons for some people to learn, perhaps all of us to learn. As we look to do God's will, we have to be patient with his time schedule. All of God's servants have had to learn to wait for things to happen according to God's time. When you think about Joseph, for example, he spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. When you think of Moses, he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep, not delivering the children of Israel at the beginning. Jesus spent the first 3 decades of his life in relative obscurity in a carpenter shop before he called even one disciple. And I suspect that many of you are like me. I don't like being tested. It's hard enough to have to spend time in the crucible. But the really hard part is when we have to ask the question, how long? How long until this is resolved? And I think that's what we see in the life of Elijah. Now, as we look at all these things, it seems to me that there are a number of things we can learn. I want to focus on 3 lessons quickly this evening, and then the lesson will be yours. First of all, I want us to see that trials are common. You already know that. And I'm not talking about the fact that we all experience them, that it's not common to man, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. That's certainly true. Everybody gets to go through those things. But I'm talking about the fact that we experience them frequently, that trials come up again and again and again. I want you to think about Job for a moment. Go to Job chapter 1, and I want us to read a little bit beginning in verse 13. Job 1, verse 13. It says, "Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Verse 16. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another, and if I were Job, I'd have said, Don't say a word. I do not want to hear it. But he didn't. He said, Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, thankfully, not all trials are that severe. But sometimes they feel that persistent, don't they? They seem to come one after another, and there are times when it seems that we go back to back to back with trials. And they may not all be the same magnitude, but they sometimes come one after another. It's an understatement to say that we don't always understand what's going on, and it's easy to get discouraged during those times. Isn't that true? And one mistake we sometimes make is believing that because our trials are constant, that means God has to be distant. But I want to point out that's not necessarily true. In fact, it may be that he's never been closer than at those points in time. And it may be that we have been put in the crucible, so to speak, so that we might be refined and he might make us suitable for his purposes. Perhaps he has something in mind for us that requires some continuing education. You ever thought about that? It's hard to do that in the midst of trials, to think about what God might be accomplishing in our lives. But that's what we need to do. It's important for us to keep that in mind. But there's a second lesson I think we need to see in all of this, and that is that patience is something we need. Perseverance. And here's what I mean by that. You know, going to Zarephath, that wasn't really a great challenge. Staying in Zarephath, that was a challenge. Elijah's stay in the city of Zarephath prepared him, at least in part, for what he was going to face later on, when he was going to go to Mount Carmel and he was going to face the prophets of Baal there. Going to Zarephath may have been part of the test, but so was staying there as long as God wanted him to stay. He certainly wouldn't have learned what God wanted him to learn if he'd only, let's just take a weekend trip up to Zarephath, up to the heart of Baal country. He wouldn't have learned all that God intended to teach him. Have you ever noticed the kind of emphasis that is placed on patience and perseverance in the Scriptures? The kind of person God is looking for in his service is the kind of person whose faith has deep roots. God is looking for people who will stay with him and will do that even in the midst of a test. And he has promised that he will be there, and he's promised that he will not allow us to be tested beyond what we're able. It's not that he won't give you more than you can handle, but he's promised that in the midst of giving you more than you can handle, he will make a way of escape. And that's not a promise to help us get out from under the test. It's a promise to help us get through it, to do that successfully. And it's only then that we can truly benefit from the things that we've experienced. So we sometimes have the test happen, and we want, we cry uncle to begin with. We want out. That's not how it works. James would say in James chapter 1 and verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." If someone came to you and said, "Do you want to be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing?" Absolutely. Okay, here's a test that will help. No, I don't want that. I want the easy route to perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Well, there's not one. We need to have patience. And then third, I want us to see that God's faithful. There's a principle I think we need to understand, and that is if God directs us to do something, if he commands us to do something, then he will provide us with whatever it is that we need in order to do it. That's just a principle you see all through Scripture. And so if God tells someone to go and camp out in the wilderness by a dry brook, then guess what? He will provide the food and the water. That's what he did. And if he tells someone to go and live with a starving widow, then he will take care of the necessities. I'll just go and tell you, the menu in Zarephath was not extravagant. Most of the time they had bread and water. And on occasion they would change things up and they'd have water and bread, but that's about it. That's all they had. But their needs were met. So I want to ask you a question this evening. Do you believe God will provide everything you need to serve him? And to do that faithfully? If we believe that, why do we sometimes worry about what we don't have? Why do we treat those things as if we can't possibly live without them? Because when we do that, perhaps we say more about what we truly believe than we would like to admit. Sometimes we don't believe God's all we need. And so by the time we get to this point, by this point in time, Elijah's had a pretty good file on record of God's faithfulness, hasn't he? He has seen his trustworthiness. And when he will later go up against the bigger obstacles and face the stronger battles, he will have these resources to rely upon. That's what God is doing here. He'll be able to relive in his mind and in his heart what God has already done for him, for the challenges that God has brought him through and made him stronger in the midst of. And he knew that what God says he will do, God will provide. He had shown that to him time and time and time again. And you know what we have in this book are a lot of promises that God has made to us. We have what he's done in our lives to help us face the trials that we have gone through and what we're going to face in the future. I want to ask you, is the food on your table any less from God than the food that Elijah ate at the widow's table? No. In the midst of all the trials we face, to help us stay with him and to stay with what he has promised. But the question for us is this: will we learn the lesson we're intended to learn? We can be sure that we're going to face trials. We're going to go through our fair share of tests, and we may go through more than our fair share of tests. And the kind of training, the kind of continuing education that comes at those times is necessary in the lives of God's servants. He wants to refine us. And that's why each of us is going to spend our time in Zarephath. We're going to spend our time in the crucible. Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, he says, in this, and he's talking about a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time, if you look back, in this you rejoice. We all like to think about that, don't we? We want to look forward to that salvation that's ready to be revealed in the last time. That is a wonderful thought. It's a great thing to look forward to. And so he says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. That's the end result. Though now for a little while, if necessary, we may be grieved by various trials. And so I'm not saying that when we face the trials that any of this is going to make any of them any easier. That's not how that works. They're still difficult. But what all of this does is it gives us something to hang on to, doesn't it? We have an anchor that has, entered in behind the curtain. We have something that's grounded. I tell you what, we just need to hang on to it. And that's what we need to do when the trials come, is to stay grounded in the great promises that God has made and keep pushing forward. If you're here tonight, we can help you in some way in your relationship with the Lord. Maybe you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ. If not, Jesus said, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. That is his promise. And if you have not done that, then that is your greatest need at this point in time. And if you've done that, maybe you let the trials and the various things you face in life, it kind of just knocks you to the ground. It does that to people. I tell you what, we want to help you get up if that's the case, because that's what God's people do. You know, Elijah thought he was all alone, and it's interesting that he would basically say that to the Lord, and the Lord said, no, not really. 7,000, Elijah, who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone. It may seem that way at times. And that's true for all of us. And so if we can help you in some way this evening, we want to encourage you to come as we stand and as we sing.
Oh, Father.